What's going on, y'all? KM Best here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel snapper, here to look into the future, where we are going to be talking about the cards releasing in February. They are the members of Thanos' feared Black Order. First up is the Season Pass card, Black Swan. She costs 2. She has 3 power, and her on-reveal ability makes 1-cost cards cost 0 on the next turn. There is a long history of cost reduction being quite strong in Marvel Snap, so I expect a lot of people to think that this card is instantly going to be good. However, I have some worries about it. Number one, I'm not really sure where she fits. I'm sure you're watching this right now going, KM, she goes in Bounce, she goes in Zoo. And it's like, does she actually? Let's take those in order. In Bounce, she ends up being worse than Falcon and worse than Beast, because Bounce is based around reusing those effects. Yes, playing your stuff for free is good, which is why Beast is so good in the deck, because it lets you play your stuff for free and put them back in your hand. When you are playing Bounce, a lot of your game plan is repeating these on reveals. Getting them to be 0 cost is cool with something like Hitmonkey. Sure, I got no issues with that. That's cool. Totally. But it's not what the deck is built around doing. It's a very cool thing to do, but I don't know if it's worth including a card just to make your Hitmonkey 2 to 6 points bigger on the final turn of the game if you don't draw Beast. And if you do draw Beast, this card isn't doing anything. In Zoo, I think there's maybe more of a case for this kind of card, but the issue Zoo would have is that you kind of want your turn 5 to be Blue Marvel, you want your turn 4 to be Khazar, you want your turn 3 to be Kyera, and then you want to play all your ones late in the game so you can't get interacted with and they don't know where your power is going. That's how Zoo plays, and so it's like, when am I actually wanting to play this on turn 5? I suppose what you could do is play this on turn 5 and play Blue Marvel and a bunch of stuff on the other turns, but it's like, what are you playing alongside it? And that's the main issue it seems to have. This is a card that wants to be played on turn 5 in the decks that want it, but it's a very lackluster turn 5 because you need to pair it with a 3 in a way that makes sense. And I think it's hard to justify including this card in your deck when there are only 12 cards in the deck. Now, this is sort of a fixable problem. Like, I think the fundamental issue this card has is that she's just not big enough. This card needs to have a more reasonable body. This card needs to be a sizable presence in the lane. And the reason that matters is because a bunch of 1-cost cards are not going to be sizable presences in the lane. That's the whole point of playing these decks of 1-cost cards, is you get more out of them than you should for a 1-cost card. But they're still pretty small. And you don't want to play another small card to make those cards slightly cheaper, because the whole point of playing all the small stuff is that it's cheap in the first place. Then you start asking me questions like, okay, so what stat line can you give her? And that's kind of where I run into a brick wall, right? Because if you give her a 4-cost stat line, you make her like a 4/6, suddenly Zabu's an issue with her. You give her a 5-cost stat line, that's compelling to me, but at what point does she just become better Sarah, right? Like, at what point do you have 5/7, 5/8 Black Swan just being better Sarah? Like, isn't that just a really, really, really strong card? And so I don't know exactly what they can do with this. Like, they could make it a 3/4, but that honestly feels too small. And if you make it a 3/5, that feels like, okay, you're really verging on like saying, we want this card to be explicitly good, which I guess you probably should do. Like, in a world where Gladiator exists, 3/5 isn't that bad. My instinct is that the most interesting cost for her is going to be 4 or 5. But the point is, at 2/3, like, she's just not worth putting in a lot of these decks, is my read on her. It's not that 2/3 is a bad stat line. It's more about how she needs to be an actual card that can potentially be a presence in a lane when your deck is so light on that. Playing more things that don't win lanes in your deck is not the way to make the deck better. That's my read on the card. I think she'll be exciting, but at 2/3, fundamentally, I just don't see her getting a lot of stuff done. She's very cool and very interesting, but I'm not sure she actually makes the cut in a lot of top decks if she keeps this stat line. Releasing in the Spotlight caches alongside Black Swan is going to be Supergiant, and she is just weird. Her effect says that all cards played the next turn don't reveal until the game ends. And that's a hard card to evaluate outside of context. I would say this is likely the most context-dependent card in the entire game, because you are going to be playing her in order to stop your opponent activating something that needs to be activated on a specific turn. And that is only something that you can judge as being worthwhile if you know what you're doing with her. My thought process with Supergiant is she reminds me of a Shang-Chi or Enchantress type card, but much more narrow. She is the Shang-Chi or Enchantress card for like specific combo decks. Like if you're playing against like Living Tribunal and they're really trying to do like Onslaught Mystique stuff, she can mess that up. If you're Zabooing this out to prevent a Loki flipping, she can mess that up. But you need to have a pretty good idea of what you're doing to include this card in the deck over Shang-Chi or Enchantress. That's sort of the issue that I see with her. I actually consider her pretty exciting, but the fact that she says the next turn and she doesn't work on the turn that she is played is a significant downgrade to what she was originally data mined as. That version of the card, I think, was likely to be too strong, extremely powerful, and I think that moving her ability back to only working on the turn after, making her less of a priority monster, makes it a lot harder to do anything really degenerate with her, like, you know, Eliath a bunch of stuff, things of that nature, and it does sort of relegate her to, like, alt and probably more narrow Shang-Chi. I don't exactly know how to judge this card. There's a world where, like, I'm comparing it to some of the best cards in the game, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, but you know what else could be compared to some of the best cards in the game? Was Shadow King when it came out as a 4/3. It could be compared in that it is similar, it's just worse and more narrow, and we saw what happened with Shadow King was he had to go down to 2/2 to end up being a good card, and he is a good card now. But I don't know if they have that kind of leeway to make a card like this that much cheaper, because the cheaper she is, the more annoying she is. And I think that this is a card that is going to be, if it does end up good, is either going to come out of the gate and it's going to be way more broken than I think it is, or it'll take like months for people to figure out how this card actually makes sense. I cannot tell you which of those it's going to be. I'm leaning towards the second one, and I am interested in this card. I think it is compelling. I think it is an interesting, specific target, and I think it's good that something like this exists in the game. Like, think about setting this up so you can Cosmo something later. Like, that is compelling to me. I do like it. You can also use it proactively. For example, you can use it to prevent your cards from revealing, so you can use it as like an alternate Invisible Woman, so you can go like, you know, Invisible Woman, but you won't be able to do that the right way. So here's the issue with doing it that way. You want to do it like, oh, Invisible Woman, MODOK, Hela. Here's the thing. She reveals at the end of the game, which means if you play this into MODOK, MODOK's going to go off after Hela. So that's a problem. And there are probably ways to make that work for you. I just don't know exactly what they are. This is probably the most interesting card of the entire bunch for me, because there is so much context that goes into whether or not I want to play her as a defensive tool against other decks, and B, so many things to try to figure out if there's a way to break her the other way. This is a fascinating card. I'm really excited for it, but I don't expect other people to be excited for it. Next up is Cull Obsidian. He is a 4/9, and you can only play him where you already have a 1-cost card. It seems like they were aiming for making Thanos better with this guy, and I think you could argue they were doing that with Black Swan, but that's just so fundamentally not the way Thanos plays that I kind of don't think they were aiming for that there. This card, though, is actually the kind of card Thanos could play in a world where Thanos wasn't a Lockjaw deck. Like, this specific card makes me so sad that Lockjaw exists, because why would you bother with it? Why would you bother playing a 4/9 in your Thanos deck when you could just play a 1/12 by putting a stone into Lockjaw? Why would you bother doing it? And that's sort of frustrating to me, because I think these cards were released with the intent of, making interesting Thanos decks happen. And there is one card that is the reason those interesting Thanos decks can't happen. And that's because that card is Lockjaw. And that reason for why that happens is because if you're playing a Lockjaw deck against a non-Lockjaw deck in the Thanos mirror, the Lockjaw deck gets more free stuff, and that usually wins the mirror. And so you're out here spending 4 energy for a Cull Obsidian, and they're out here lockjawing into a Magneto, and you feel like an idiot. And that is something that I really do want them to address at some point, especially in the context of you are literally releasing a season of like mid-rangey Thanos cards. What are we doing here? Like, what? Why are we going to release all these cards and then just have them not go into the deck that you want them to go in because Lockjaw goes in it and does that thing better than the deck you want them to go in? I am a little bit excited for him and Zoo. I might just be stupid for this one, but like, I do think there's like a coherent argument for like, okay, let's play Zoo with Zabu, Shang-Chi, Khazar, and this guy. And you will be able to do what you can in that context. Zoo lacks the ability to go tall. I probably will try this. I don't expect it to be good, but I probably will try it. One other question I have is exactly how his play restriction works. Like, I think this could determine if the card is good or bad. If there has to be, like, at the start of the turn, a 1-cost card in the lane, this card is probably unplayable. If there has to be, like, if you could put a 1-cost card in a lane and then put him in that lane, suddenly the card looks a lot more appealing. And I'm really hoping that it's the second one. Because if it's the first one, I gotta say, I don't think they know what they're doing. But if it's the second one, I think that is a totally reasonable and interesting card. And I am operating as if it's the second one. But, because I can't imagine that they would actually make it be the first one, because the first one is so you can't charge anyone any money for a card if that's the way this is implemented. You just can't charge anyone any money. I'm literally stuttering thinking of like, you can't do that, man. Like, there's no way. There cannot be a way. I refuse to believe that they have set it up like that. If they have, I mean, I just don't know what they're doing here anymore. Next up is Corvus Glaive, who actually helped me realize something about Marvel Snap that I did not know. Chat, did you know that most of the people, I don't know why I just called you chat, there's no chat here, viewer, did you know that almost every discard card is someone who uses a weapon? This is what twigged me to this. Glaive, that's his weapon. Corvus Glaive, he has a glaive. He uses a weapon. He discards cards, right? Blade, Swordmaster, Corvus Glaive. Like, if it weren't for Hellcow, all I'm saying is there would be some actual theming going on here. Like, the names, they have weapons in the name. I've been playing this game for like 18, 19 months. I had not realized that. That's on me. Anyway, this guy is a card I just don't understand. I don't know who he's for. I don't think he's very good. What he does effectively is be backup bad Electro or mid Hellcow, and I already don't like playing Hellcow in my discard decks because the random discards hitting MODOK is like actually game losing, and I just don't know where he makes sense, except I think he probably makes a ton of sense in Hela. I think Hela is a deck that is actually going to want what this card does. Multiple discard triggers are pretty interesting, and having a ramp backup plan when you have so many giant redundant big guys is interesting to me too. I'm not sure he's going to go in Hela, but I can envision a Hela deck that actually makes sense with him because there are so many large 6-drops in that deck. You just make a deck full of Hela and large 6s, you discard whatever you discard. If you discard Hela, okay, that sucks, but people will start snapping into you, and if you can win the game with your ramp backup plan, that's actually a pretty high cube equity situation. I just don't think he makes a ton of sense anywhere else. I think of decks that are like, I would want a second Electro, and almost every deck that would want a second Electro would be better suited playing Wave. And I think the delta between going from one Electro to two Electros, Electro Wave, and going from Electro Wave to adding Corvus, I think it's much bigger to go from one enabler to two enablers than it is to go from two enablers to three, especially when your third enabler could end up discarding your payoff. I am not seeing it with this guy. I don't exactly know where he fits other than Hela. I will say that he makes me want to consider some sort of, mid-rangey discard thing that can just like use that energy well, like a X-23, Wolverine, Swarm, Proxima Midnight, the next card coming out, like that kind of deck. But the issue is that kind of deck is the kind of deck that really wants to be a Shang-Chi deck because you're just putting some efficient stats on the board. You want to have these specific tech cards in hand, and discarding cards is a really good way to guarantee that you don't have those specific tech cards in hand and that your opponent knows that you don't have those specific tech cards in hand. So it's just an idea that it's like, okay, this sounds good, this sounds good, this sounds good, and then it runs into the brick wall of reality, which is discarding two cards is really bad. It's really bad unless you're like a real discard deck, and I don't know how many of those there are. In the real discard deck, maybe you run this over Hellcow, but I don't like running Hellcow anyway, and discard doesn't need the energy. Like, I feel like this guy is trying to do two things at the same time and ends up doing neither of them well, and I think if I had to pick a card that I think is likely to be the worst card from the season, this is it, which is weird, because he feels like a card that I should be able to turn the downside into an upside, but I just can't figure it out. Proxima Midnight is a 4/6 that serves as a slightly more targeted Wolverine in discard decks, and I actually think this card is legitimately pretty sick. I don't know if it's enough in terms of like making discard good again. It's the kind of card that I am just built to like, though. This is exactly what I want to be doing. This turns MODOK into like basically Black Bolt stature. Like, that's actually legitimately interesting in those discard decks. I don't know if it's enough, but it is legitimately interesting. I do think that they're like aiming for for Corvus Glaive to be good with this card. And again, like when you try to put a deck like that together, it's like you do like your Dakins, your X-23s, your Wolverines, your Proxima Midnights. But decks like that fundamentally are limited in terms of points. Like, there's an archetype of decks, and I think a lot of the decks I like to play fall into this, are decks that put points on the board and then rely on tech to take you home. Darkhawk decks are like the base example of this. Most of the bounce decks that I play are like this. Annihilus decks tend to be like this. They're decks that are putting points on the board and then playing, a Shang-Chi and Enchantress, things of that nature. And the deck that I'm describing with like Ebony Maw, Proxima Midnight, Wolverine, Dakin, it's one of those decks. And not Ebony Maw, Corvus Glaive. And Corvus Glaive discarding your good stuff is so awful that I don't know if you can afford to do it. But it is interesting because there's so many payoffs for just getting discarded now. There's Swarm, there's the Dakin stuff you put in your hand, X-23, Wolverine, this card. There's legitimately like 5 good discard payoffs at this point, and I am interested to see what happens if you just jam them all in a deck with some cards that want to discard cards. Like, that does seem pretty compelling to me. It's just, I don't know if that includes Corvus Glaive, but it does probably include this card. Like, this is a card that I want to play in that Dakin X-23 type deck. That makes a ton of sense to me. We play like Silver Samurai type stuff. We maybe play Black Bolt as well. We're doing like Black Bolt stature and this guy. We got our tech cards. And yeah, we're probably not playing Corvus Glaive, but we would be playing this. And I am pretty compelled by that because we haven't had a mid-range deck of that nature in a very long time. And I do think hand attack is pretty valuable. I am interested to see how it goes. And generally speaking, I just think this card is pretty cool. All right, y'all. Thank you for going on that journey with me. Once we are closer to the actual season starting, I will be doing my typical Spotlight Cash review, but I try to wait on those as long as I can so we can make sure that data mines are as up to date as they possibly can be. On that note, please do understand that I am talking about data mined versions of these cards. I am obviously not liable for any changes that may happen to these cards in the near future. And if they change those cards, then my evaluations will also change. I'm just looking at them to get a sense of what these cards might be like, what my thought processes are with each of them, where I would start building with each of them, maybe give you some deck ideas, things to get excited about in the coming month. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, these are DATAMINES, and I will see you in the next one. Remember, of course, I will be doing that full Spotlight Cash review as we get closer to the actual date. Hopefully by that point, we will have, I guess, quote-unquote, final DATAMINES. I don't know if that's real, because Beta Ray Bill just got like an extra power within like the last 2 or 3 days or something. So I don't know if anything's actually final ever, but hey, at least we have an idea of the shape of these cards. Thank you so much. I've been KM Best. I will see you in the next one.